Good morning, guys. Today we're going to change the steering gear in a 2009 Jeep Wrangler, Rocky Mountain Edition. The reason why we're changing the steering gear is because I've got a lot of play in the steering, and whenever I drive the Jeep it tends to drift. I've got 2 inches play in the steering wheel, and I find that I'm always correcting. It can be dangerous on icy roads. But before we get started, we're going to need to have a few things. I recommend that a week before you do this, you get some good penetrating oil and you soak all of the nuts and bolts to make sure that it gets in there and loosens up all the rust, and that it's going to make taking the power steering lines off and loosening the nuts that much easier. I recommend that you get a set of crow foot wrenches. Sometimes they're called claw foot wrenches, but they look kind of like this. So what this is going to allow you to do is to slide the wrench head over the power steering lines that go into the steering gear, and you can put an extension into here, and you'll be able to use your ratchet up high above the engine in order to loosen those power steering lines, because they're in there quite hard. And the other reason why you need this is because when we go to put it back together, we're going to want to torque them in, and this will allow us to use our torque wrench. You're going to need a Pitman arm puller. Pitman arm puller looks something like this. You can get them at Princess Auto, at Canadian Tire, or if you're in the States, you can even get them at AutoZone. You can rent them at AutoZone if you don't want to buy one. It's not the kind of thing you're going to use a lot, so you might want to rent it. You're going to need a quart or a liter if you're in Canada of power steering fluid, because the people who sell the steering gears, the remanufactured steering gears, recommend that you flush your power steering system to get any dirt and crud out of there to make sure it doesn't damage the new steering gear. You're going to need a 33mm socket. It doesn't have to be impact, but you're going to need this to take the nut off the bottom of the Pitman arm to disconnect the steering box. Then you're going to need a torque wrench and potentially a breaker bar. You can get these things, I recommend Princess Auto in Canada, but you can get them at a number of different places. Again, shop around because the prices can vary hugely on these kind of things. But they are something that you're going to use a lot, so you might want to invest a little bit of money in there. I suggest that you get some good wheel chocks. I got these at Canadian Tire this morning. They're awesome. I'm going to put them under the passenger side rear wheel because I'm going to jack up the front of the Jeep here in a bit, and we're going to get started. So, I do recommend that when you go shopping, I know I make a lot of recommendations, sorry about that. I do recommend that you shop around for your steering gear, because at Chrysler here in Canada, a new steering gear is in excess of $900. I found one online at a place called Rock Auto in the States. They do remanufactured steering gears. I got mine for $250, and if I send the steering gear core back, I'll get a $100 refund. So the difference in price between new and remanufactured is huge, and I guess time will tell whether there's a difference in quality. Let's get started. Okay, so this is what the steering gear looks like. This is a remanufactured one, and you can see this is where the steering shaft is going to go in, and it's actually got, it's keyed. It's got flat piece on the top and bottom, but it's also got a little notch on the side where we're going to put the bolt through. So it's pretty hard to mess up that alignment. Then at the bottom of the steering gear, you're going to see that there's a spline, and there's also another key. Like the spline has a bunch of like 4 or 5 teeth in a row, and then it has a gap. So it's, if you can get it lined, when you get it lined up, it's pretty hard to get it off center. And this is where the Pitman arm is going to go. So, and then on the top of the steering gear, of course, there's a nut and there's a little hex key, and that is for adjusting play in the steering gear. Hopefully this one being brand new, it's not going to need any play. You can see they put a little bit of green goo on there just to mark where they want it to be placed, because hopefully they've already calibrated this piece. So the guys at Chrysler who designed the Jeep haven't really made massive changes in the design over the years, but they've made improvements. And one of the things that's really nice here, you'll see down here at the bottom, those are the 2 hoses going into the top of the steering gear, and this is the steering gear down here. That's, so you can see mine's a little rustier than the one that was on the bench, but the overflow for the rad is this coolant tank, and the coolant tank lifts right off. So all you have to do is grab it from the bottom and just give it a tug, and it comes right off. So then we can just set that up on top of the engine, and it gives us a nice view of the steering gear that we're going to replace, so we can get right in there and work. So now we're under the Jeep, and we're taking a look at the steering gear from the bottom. You can see there's the nut on the Pitman arm, and there's the Pitman arm itself coming up to the steering linkage. But in order to get our ratchet in there, when we jack the Jeep up, we're going to have to get rid of this torsion bar. So you want to do that while the Jeep is on the ground, otherwise it'll be under pressure and it might snap down on you, or you might not be able to get the bolt out. So we're going to take this bolt out and then we're going to jack the Jeep up. So here we are looking at that torsion bar from below. You can see I've loosened up the nut, and if I just give that a little tug, torsion bar just drops right down, out of the way. That was a number 21 socket, by the way, front and back, in order to loosen that nut. Now we've jacked up the Jeep, and you can see we've got a good quality jack, something that can handle the weight. This one is actually a 12-ton capacity. And we got some axle stands in there just for extra safety, in case we have a problem. And now we're going to do the trickiest part of the job, which is getting the pitman arm off. So here I've got my 33mm socket and my breaker bar on the bottom of the pitman arm. And we're going to take that nut off. So in order to do that, I'm going to have to brace my foot against the wheel and reef with everything I have in order to get that nut off, because it's on there really good. One thing I forgot to mention earlier is it's important, just to make the job easier, to have your tires aligned straight forward before you start. That'll mean that the steering wheel on the inside will be in the proper position as well. And when we put the new steering gear in, we'll just line up the shafts so that everything ends up perfectly aligned and the steering wheel ends up perfectly square. See ya. So I managed to get the nut off the bottom of the pitman arm without too much difficulty. And that's what it looks like. So now we're going to go ahead and get the pitman arm puller on there and see if we can wedge this thing loose. So now we have the puller in place. You can see that the center screw actually goes right inside the shaft that comes out of the bottom of the steering gear, and then the clamps grab around the top and bottom of the pitman arm. So now we're going to tighten that up with a ratchet and see if we can pull it loose, and if that doesn't work, then we'll put the impact wrench on there. Great thing about time-lapse photography is you don't have to sit around while I fight with this damn thing, but it is being difficult, and I have torqued that pitman arm puller really tight. So definitely wear safety glasses when you're doing this kind of thing, because I've seen more than one of those pitman arm pullers break, and this one may do that. So keep going and see what happens. Well, it's our lucky day, boys and girls, because that sucker just came right off. So while I was down there underneath the Jeep fighting with that pitman arm, I dropped my work light and destroyed my old incandescent bulb. So I'm going to go green. I'm going to go with an LED bulb by Philips. And I can drop this one as much as I want, and it isn't going to break. For this next part, we're going to be loosening up the power steering hoses. And we're probably going to get some drippage from up above. So what we want to do is position our catch drain on the floor underneath so that we don't mess up the garage floor. Just move that over a bit underneath the steering gear, and we should be good to go. So now we're looking at the power steering lines on the top of the steering gear. We're going to take our crowfoot wrench and we're going to fit that onto the power steering lines so that we can use a extension and a ratchet in order to loosen them up. So that's going to go in there like that, and we'll be able to get our extension and ratchet into that hole at the back of the crowfoot wrench. The crowfoot wrench is a 3/8 drive with a little hole inside, but all of the wrenches or ratchets that I have that are going to allow me to torque on this are going to be 1/2-inch drive. So I've got a 3/8 to 1/2-inch converter on my first extension into a 1/2-inch extension up to my ratchet. So I had soaked that nut ahead of time with penetrating oil, and it came loose quite easily. So now I'm going to use a number 18 stubby to loosen the power steering line to the point where I can take it out. Before I finish loosening off the power steering lines into the steering box, I'm going to need to disconnect the intermediate steering shaft from the steering box as well. So I've rotated the steering shaft. You can see down here there's a nut on the top of the steering shaft. It's a number 13mm, and I'm going to use the same 1/2-inch 3/8 combination with a 13mm socket to take out that bolt. Once I take out that bolt, I should be able to push the steering shaft back, because it's actually got a spline that allows it to collapse and extend in the middle. You can see there's a boot there, and that boot will collapse and allow the steering shaft to retract. So you can see now we've got that bolt out. I had to actually put my torque wrench on that to get it to turn initially, but then with the ratchet took it right out. Now I should be able to take that steering shaft and just push it back. So here again you can see the steering shaft. And I'll just move it over a bit. You can see if I just wiggle that, it comes right off. So get that first line loose now. I'm just going to pull that up, push it off to the side, and you can see it's going to drip a bit. It's going to run down off the side of the differential into my pan down below. Now I'm going to work on the second hose. So once again I get my crowfoot wrench on there, and then I just stick my extension and ratchet in and I'll be able to loosen that up. So I got both hoses off, and the only thing left to do now is to disconnect the steering gear from the frame, pull it out, and give it a little inspection, and then we'll get the new one ready to go. This next part, taking off the steering box, the bolts are all located on the behind the driver's side front wheel, so you're going to have to remove the wheel so that you can get at these 4 bolts. Taking those 4 bolts out, and the steering gear will come right out. Before you take out all the bolts, if you're doing this by yourself like I am, it's a good idea to secure the steering gear so that it doesn't fall down when you take out the last bolt. So what I've done is I've wrapped the bungee cord around the back of the steering gear. I've brought it up and hooked it onto the support for the radiator so that when I take that last bolt out, it'll stay relatively in place. There's nothing that it can hit if it comes loose and swings, so we should be good. So disassembly complete. The bungee cord did its job, held the steering gear in place until I took out the last bolt. Then I lifted it out through the top of the Jeep. So we can see where the steering gear came out. 4 bolts in the side of the frame. Looks like it's relatively clean down there. There's a wiring harness we'll have to be careful of whenever we put things back together. Just going to move the light here so we can maybe see things a little bit better. That's still not doing it, is it? There we go. Now you can see where the bolts came out. And we'll wipe that up a little bit. We'll get the other steering gear ready to go and we'll bolt it in. So here's a view of where the steering gear is going to go from the bottom. Turns out that after a little bit of experimentation, I've determined that it's much easier to bring it up from the bottom and bolt it in place than it is to drop it from the top, even with the bungee to secure it. So that's what I'm going to do next. I'm going to lift it up in there, push the bolts in from the back, get them finger tight. Then I'll line it up on the 4 holes and tighten those bolts. Alright, so since we last chatted, I got the steering gear bolted to the side. I'm leaving the nuts that hold the steering gear to the frame just a little bit loose so that after I get everything connected, I can snug it all up and it'll self-align. Remember that when you go to put the steering shaft back onto the end of the steering gear, there's a notch in the steering gear shaft that comes out that fits the bolt. So if you don't get that aligned up properly, the bolt won't go in. Okay, so you can see the bolt there positioned, ready to go in. I'm just going to torque that in and that'll have the steering shaft reconnected. Usually the new steering gear comes with plugs in the places where the hoses go in. I've removed those plugs now, you can see. But the steering gear itself won't have any power steering fluid in it. And what we want to do is we want to get that primed, because otherwise when we first start the engine, it'll push the power steering fluid through the system, any place where there isn't any, and it'll froth. And that'll cause cavitating. So we don't want that. We want to get everything primed and ready to go. So what we're going to do is I'm going to get a funnel. I'm going to pour some power steering fluid into the steering gear. Then I'm going to turn the steering wheel to have it circulate inside. And as it goes down, I'm going to add some more. Before we reconnect the power steering hoses, in the refurb steering gear, we get 2 new rubber O-rings. And these rubber O-rings go on the bottom of the power steering hoses to seal the power steering hoses whenever they connect into the steering gear. So I'll just lift up one here so that you can see. And you can see there's a rubber seal on there now. We're going to replace that rubber seal with the new rubber seals that came with the kit. Okay, so we have the hoses attached to the top of the steering gear. Now we've centered the steering wheel and pushed the pitman arm back onto the bottom of the steering box. I've threaded the nut on, finger tight, and now I'm going to go and consult the great oracle of the internet find out what the torque setting is for that pitman arm nut, and I'm going to torque it in place. When that's done, I'm going to snug up the bolts that hold the steering box onto the frame, because they should be pretty much self-aligned now. Then I'll replace the wheel, and we should be done. One last thing here before we take the Jeep out for a test drive is we have to put that torsion bar back in place. So that should just lift right up in there, and then we can slip the nut through the hole. Now, I know I said we're done, but we're not actually completely done. We've got the rad overflow back in place. We've got all the hose tightened. We've got the steering box secured to the side of the frame. We've got the steering shaft connected. We've got the pitman arm on and torqued, and we put the torsion bar back in place, but we don't have any power steering fluid. So we're going to have to fill that up. And then what we want to do is we want to turn the motor over, but we don't want the engine to start. Because if the engine starts, then it's going to force the power steering fluid through the system too quickly, and it's going to froth. So what we want to do is we want to just turn the engine over just to turn the power steering pump so that we can prime the system. So to make sure the engine doesn't start, this is the coil for the Jeep, and you'll see there's a wire that comes into the side. That's what the voltage that feeds the coil. So if I disconnect that, I should be able to turn the engine over, but there shouldn't be any spark to any of the cylinders, so it shouldn't start. So that's that. We've got everything back together. We've turned the engine over a couple of times. We've filled up the power steering reservoir, and it's not going down anymore. So we're feeling pretty good that everything's back together and torqued in the right place and ready to go. So we're going to roll out of the garage, and we're going to run it in the yard for a little bit, check to make sure that it's not really frothy in the power steering reservoir. If it is, we'll let it sit, fill it up, and then we'll start it again in a little bit. Turns out the torque wrench I have wasn't quite good enough to torque the nut onto the pitman arm as tight as it has to be. So first things we're going to do now is we're going to head off to Canadian Tire and we're going to buy a better torque wrench. That's about it. I hope this video makes things faster for you. I started at about 9:30 and I'm finished now at 12 o'clock. So it was a good morning job. It was a little bit more difficult than your average task that you might do on your own Jeep, but whenever you finish something like this, it always feels good. Talk to you later.